Hello and welcome to More Bible, the official podcast of Reformation Covenant Church. In Jesus' high priestly prayer, he asked that his Father would sanctify his people in truth, and then affirmed, "Your word is truth." So in seeking to be a means to answering our Lord's Prayer, in each episode, pastors and church officers will take questions from church members and provide answers from the Bible so that our people can grow in a deeper, more faithful understanding and application of God's word to their daily lives. I'm Britton Brewer, the Associate Pastor at RCC, and I'm here to introduce our episode for today. In this episode, Pastor Cogbill sits down with Family Camp speaker Pastor Rich Lusk to discuss a couple of controversial topics in the American church today, namely the issue of head coverings and women pastors. Did God ever require women to cover their heads in worship, and does he still? What role might Paul's continual use of sarcasm to the Corinthians play in the text? Also, how does his other hair passage in 1 Timothy 2 and the statement that women aren't to teach but to remain silent fit with his comments in 1 Corinthians 12-14? They'll be discussing this and more today in our upcoming episode. Hope you enjoy.
Well, thanks, Rich, for stopping in with us at our family camp. Many people don't know we're going through some of the lives of David and some of the Psalms that he was singing in those circumstances. One of the things that we were going to talk about potentially was 1 Corinthians 12-14. There's just so much going on there, and to have you be able to sit down with us and talk about some of those things, in addition to the life of David, we're very appreciative of. A lot of questions have come in, so you don't know this necessarily, but this isn't one of those big fancy highbrow podcasts. This is...
You've got me fooled.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a guy from, Fort Worth, Texas, and then another guy from somewhere in Tennessee. So we have teeth brushes, not toothbrushes here, not like Alabama. But so we have an Alabama. Man, these poor people. These poor people.
We're really out of place.
We're in
here.
big trouble. Yeah. But we've got, similar to your church, we have a lot of new people coming in, lots of questions, and Corinthians is one of those doesn't matter how new you are to the faith, you're going to have questions about it. So I guess one of the big topics that we're seeing, not a bunch in our church, is the idea of head coverings or the necessity of head coverings. Our position is if somebody wants to wear a head covering, we're fine with that, but I think the question is whether or not there's a requirement from God's word that would, make it not just an option, but something that would be required. So I didn't know if maybe you want to start talking about it more generally, and then if we want to start nailing some things down more precisely, maybe we can do that.
Yeah. So the passage in question is the first part of 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul addresses the woman's head covering. And it's a controversial passage today. I think it's actually been more controversial through church history than is sometimes acknowledged. I think you've got some pro-head covering people who think that the history is very uniform on this question. I'm not as convinced of that. And of course, even if it were uniform, there's still the question of what is the text actually saying? And so Paul starts off in the passage talking about the head of man is Christ. He says in 1 Corinthians 11:3, he says, I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And so it seems like he's setting up some kind of analogy between how Jesus, who obviously is fully equal to God in his ministry, submitted to his Father. And you see references to that in the Gospels where he says he came to do his Father's will. He obeys the Father. He only does what he sees the Father doing. So you've got all of that. And that seems to be an analogy for the way he understands the husband-wife relationship. I take it when he's talking here about the man as the head of woman, that he's talking about a husband-wife relationship, not that men in general are the heads of women in general. I think it's got to be a husband-wife kind of relationship there. And then he goes on to talk about how every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. And that's an interesting, sometimes we get so caught up in discussing what this means for the women, we lose what it means for the men. If you think back to the Old Covenant, the priests did wear head coverings. The high priest had a kind of turban or there's different words that could be used for it, but he wore a head covering when he ministered in the presence of God. And now in the new covenant, it seems that's been taken away because now the veil has been torn. We've been granted access into the very presence of God, into the heavenly sanctuary, and so men are to come with uncovered heads. The question then is what he starts to talk about in verse 5. Every woman who prays and prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is the one and the same as if her head were shaved. And I'm not going to go through all of this. I'll just kind of summarize what I think, and then if you want to add to that or give an alternative view or further questions, whatever you want to do with it, I would say this is how I read the passage. And I think really the key is when you come down to the end of the passage, when he says, does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him? The Nazarites would be an exception to that, but otherwise, men typically have shorter hair than women. And then he says, if a woman has long hair, it is a glory for her hair is given to her for a covering. And I take that to mean that whatever else is going on with the head covering for a woman, having longer hair than her husband is a covering. And that Paul wants the sexes to be distinguished. He wants them to be visibly distinguished. So men look one way, women look another way, and that should be evident in worship. I don't think so. There are some who say, well, it can't just be that her hair is covering. There's got to be some additional covering, and they'll make their argument from this passage. I won't go into all the details of that, but I would push back on that, not only from what I think this passage says, but also the fact that we've got other passages in the New Testament that address what women do with their hair, particularly in worship. So in 1 Peter 3 and in 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul and Peter talk about, don't have your hair braided, ostentatiously, that kind of thing. And it would be very odd that we would have those kind of instructions if every woman was going into church with some kind of veil that just completely covered her. So I just don't think it makes sense to say that she's got some kind of covering over her face, her head, her hair, whatever it might be. And of course, that is one of the questions is even if you wanted to obey this, you've got to figure out what the head covering is, how much of the hair or head has to be covered. What does that look like? And we're just not told. But I don't think that's really what Paul's talking about at all. I think Paul wants the sexes distinguished, and hair is one natural way that is done. Nature teaches us men are typically to have shorter hair, women longer hair. And for the woman, her long hair is a covering, and it is her glory. It is a sign of her submission to her husband, and it's a glory that God has given to her. And I think it's representative of other forms of glory that come from the woman. That's really the role of the woman, is to be the glorifier. And Jim Jordan and others have made this kind of point that anything that a husband gives to his wife, she will take and glorify. He gives her seed, she gives back a child. He gives her groceries, she gives back a meal. He gives her a house, she turns it into a home. Those are beautiful ways in which the woman takes what the man gives, what the man provides, and glorifies it. And so I think in terms of the relationship between the husband and his wife in this passage, that's what it's getting at. But I think this passage is mainly about worship, and I think it's mainly about conduct in worship. And I think the point is that the sexes are to be distinguished in worship. It is interesting, there's kind of this new head covering movement. There's kind of been a renaissance of this among some Reformed Protestants in recent years. And one question I've asked those people who are advocating for women to wear some kind of head covering is, okay, if a woman has a head covering, is she allowed to pray or prophesy in your church? Is she allowed to assume some kind of role of liturgical leadership as long as she has her head covered? And I haven't found one yet who would say yes. So I actually think when Paul says, when he speaks about a woman praying or prophesying, he doesn't want women to pray or prophesy in the sense of taking liturgical leadership at all. And I think you get that confirmed later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where he talks about how in the public gathering, women are to be silent, and it's shameful for a woman to take over liturgical leadership in a church. And I think that would be true even if she had a head covering, or even if she has long hair. It's simply not her role. If you think about the role relationship in worship, the pastor who's officiating the service represents Christ to the bride. And a woman can't play that role. She cannot be a representative of Christ because Christ is a man. And in terms of how God has designed men and women to function, men do have that role of covenant headship in normal circumstances. And so I think that's the kind of thing I think Paul is getting at So I don't think he's requiring women to wear some additional covering over their long hair. I think her long hair is sufficient. That's given to her for a covering. And I think that's the basic take I would have on the passage. A lot more can be said, obviously, but that's the basic take.
Well, and you referred to 1 Timothy 2 about the adorning and the braiding of hair, which in that text, Paul also tells Timothy that the woman should remain silent.
Same thing.
In the church. So it's interesting that hair and speaking are very tight there.
Yes.
And then here in 1 Corinthians 12, or in 1 Corinthians 14, you have the same instruction of the silence.
Right.
And then back up to 11,
You've got hair.
and you've got hair.
Right.
But he does have the phrase when praying or prophesying. So how can they both be silent and wear something when praying or prophesying? Because I think, if I'm remembering right, Calvin addresses this interestingly in that when they're doing this, here's how it should be done. And that doesn't mean he can't later say, oh yeah, and don't do this.
Right.
So how do you read the relationship between when praying or prophesying and then also remaining silent?
Well, so he says in verse 5, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. And then he goes on, verse 6, if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered.
Which it is.
Which it is, yes.
Yeah.
So I think his whole point is that if a woman were to, this is how I would take that. If a woman were to pray or prophesy, she would need to present herself like a man, which would mean shaving her head or cutting her hair very short, which is shameful. So it's very interesting. A woman speaking in church is shameful in 1 Corinthians 14 because she's taking a role that belongs to a man. 1 Corinthians 11, if she cuts her hair short to look like a man, that's shameful, and that's because she's trying to take the man's role. So it's the same kind of thing in both passages. Women who want to usurp the man's role or take on a role that belongs exclusively to men are doing something shameful. So a woman praying or prophesying in a public assembly, she might as well have her hair shaved, which I mean, Paul is taking it for granted that they understand that is a shameful thing.
Right. One, to me, that lends itself at least to the possibility that Paul's being sarcastic, because you've got things happening in Corinth that aren't addressed in other letters. The level of sarcasm Paul uses when he's writing to the Corinthians, it leaves open, at least in my mind, the possibility that he's talking about something they're doing and pointing out how absurd it is.
Yeah.
So you've taught on these passages. What do you think the chances are he's being sarcastic here?
Yeah, I think that's possible too. 1 and 2 Corinthians together are the serrated edge epistles. I mean, Paul had a gift of sarcasm, and this is where it comes out. It doesn't come out in all of his letters. It does maybe with the Galatians, which is another church that's in big trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like when Paul really wanted to make a scalding hot point with a church that's in trouble of drifting, Paul often resorts to sarcasm to make his point. So there's a kind of sanctified sarcasm at work. This is not a blank check to go use sarcasm however you want to use it. But there are places where, that's sort of in the pastor's rhetorical toolbox, or any leader's, really, you could say, rhetorical toolbox. You don't want to use it all the time, but you do see Paul using it several places in 1 Corinthians, and it's very possible this is one of them.
Because you guys have this saying, you guys have this practice, the man is the end-all be-all. And then you make these ladies put these head coverings on. That's kind of ridiculous. You guys are going to judge angels because there's the angel reference, right? So she's over angels with you. Like God's people are going to judge angels. You guys are doing this silly, silly thing. She might as well just shave her head.
Right.
And then he goes and he says, and if anyone wants to argue about it, no other church is doing this.
Right.
We have no such, the other churches have no other practice. And I think I've seen pro head covering people say, you need to wear your head coverings because everyone else is. But it seems that you could just as easily read it as you guys are being ridiculous. Right. No other church has this problem.
I think that's possible.
And that's why in Timothy, in Ephesus, he writes a letter to Timothy, talks about being silent, talks about what they're doing in worship, and he makes no mention of head coverings as though that's a part of the problem going on in Ephesus.
And all he addresses, again, is the overly ostentatious braids and that kind of thing with with a woman's hair. So I think that's entirely possible. Yeah.
Well, thanks. That's helpful. I think I'm glad that you don't think that they're making angels lust. So I appreciate you not bringing that into the equation. That'll take us to Genesis 6, which we're not going to do today. Britton can handle that one while I'm on sabbatical. You did bring up another question that a lot of our folks can sometimes come into our churches and ask about, and that's male leadership in liturgical setting. A lot of the questions come in about having a woman leading liturgy, having her leading worship, having her sing. They're used to even relatively conservative, reformed, evangelical churches who wouldn't have a woman preach, have them doing other things. So maybe can you start talking about why it does look so different in our circles? And I think you got into it because we read our Bibles typologically in some ways that aren't as wooden. Yeah. So they might say a woman can't even teach Sunday school because women aren't allowed to speak, so they'll go hardcore there. But then they'll have a woman helping lead music because she's not preaching. So,
well, let's bracket out something like Sunday school because that's a little bit different question than what happens in the liturgy. So this is how I think about it. Presbyterians have what's called the regulative principle, and while I think that's been misunderstood, and to some degree, the way the regulative principle was applied early on in reformational history, I think was an overreaction to Roman Catholicism. Like, let's find a way to strip everything out of the service that's not explicitly commanded. I think if you actually read the Bible holistically, if you understand that there's typology present in the Old Testament that informs practices in the New Covenant, then I think you're going to have, one example of this would be the church calendar. There are a lot of Presbyterians who've argued against the church calendar because they would say, well, we're not commanded to celebrate Jesus' birth with Christmas or to have special services to celebrate his ascension or to recognize Pentecost or something like that. But the thing is, God did give to Israel a calendar. And so I would say as a general equity application, like the principle that God gave to his people a calendar means that we do have freedom to develop a calendar, not as a matter of divine obligation. We're not going to say that this is absolutely necessary, but as a matter of wisdom, as a tool of discipleship. God gave his people a calendar in the Old Covenant, and it makes sense that we would develop one in the New Covenant to celebrate these new
great
covenant
acts of
events,
redemption.
These great acts of redemption that have now happened. And one thing you see in the Old Covenant is that Israel actually had freedom and some flexibility there to add to the calendar as God did new things in history. So like the Feast of Purim in the book of Esther gets added.
Festival of Lights.
Festival of Lights, which Jesus celebrates in the Gospel of John. So you have these things, added in the Old Covenant, and I would say that gives us freedom in the New Covenant to develop a church calendar. So the regulative principle has got to be understood, I think, in an expansive way that includes the types and patterns that you find in Old Covenant worship. So I would say that in one thing that you see is that liturgical leadership is masculine. Liturgical leadership is a masculine role. There are no priestesses in the Old Covenant, and that's really important that there are no priestesses in Israel because all of the pagan religions around them had priestesses. This is interesting when it comes to 1 Timothy chapter 2 because Timothy is in Ephesus, and in Ephesus, the most dominant building in the city is the temple to Diana, who is the goddess of sex and fertility and some other things. And so you've got people who are very used to having women in leadership roles in religious services. And that seems to be what Paul's addressing in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and basically saying, look, in the church, it's not that way. And Paul goes back to the creation account there, the Genesis 2 and 3, the account of the creation and the fall, because that's the original worship service. Adam and his wife are not just the first husband-wife pair. They're a paradigm for marriage because they're the first married couple, but it's also the first paradigm we have for a pastor and his congregation. And he's the pastor, she's the congregation, and so he represents God and speaks for God to the bride. So if you think about Genesis chapter 2, God gives Adam the prohibition that they are not to eat of this one special tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God gives him that prohibition before the woman is created, so that by divine design, he will have to preach that to her. He will have to deliver that rule to her. and she'll have to receive it from him as God's representative, as God's spokesman. And that sets up a kind of role relationship between the sexes for all subsequent liturgy. So then throughout the history of God's people, it's always liturgical leadership is always masculine, and I think that's really important to keep in view. So why is it so problematic? Why does Paul say that it's shameful for a woman to take on this role of liturgical leadership? Well, C.S. Lewis has got a great article on priestesses.
Yes.
Women's ordination, where he basically says that if you understand what's happening and you put a woman in a place of liturgical leadership, which now many churches do, churches that may not have the woman preach the sermon will still have her play a role of liturgical leadership, like reading the Bible, reading the scriptures to the congregation or leading in prayer, things like that. And Lewis says that is a fundamental change in our religion. Like you couldn't do that without fundamentally changing what the Christian faith is. A religion that has that recognizes God as Father, that recognizes that God sent his Son. Okay, so you think about that. Father, Son, those are masculine designations that God has given to himself. If you understand what's happening in the liturgy, the one who's leading the service represents the Father, represents Jesus, represents the Son to the bride. And that's what's happening there. And so when you tamper with that, Lewis says it's basically like if you started calling God our mother,
right,
or if you assume that God could have sent a female Messiah. And at that point, you really are drifting off into some form of paganism. Yeah, I mean, androgyny, lesbianism, something altogether different. It just means a different kind of religion. Then you think about all that's going on in our culture, the confusion that we have about sex and sexuality, the confusion that we have about masculinity and femininity. It is actually much more difficult to get people to understand the gospel when they are confused about men and women, because the gospel is a story about a masculine Messiah coming to rescue his bride. And so if you don't think that gender has any built-in meaning, that there's no built-in design to it, the gospel is not going to make any sense to you. And so it's almost like getting things right with the sexes is a form of pre-evangelism. And so in our culture, we that's another hurdle we've got to overcome in order to get people to understand the gospel. In a lot of cases, the gospel is marital, and marriage is a picture of the gospel. It's Ephesians 5 is to be a picture of Christ in the church. So these things are right at the heart of what happens in liturgy. They're right at the heart of the gospel. It's right at the heart of the Christian faith. They're not. Obviously, you have Orthodox churches that do put women up in front, like of the congregation, like that. I think they're making a grave mistake. And I would just say that's something that ought to be a red flag for any church.
Yeah, and sometimes what gets lost in this conversation is just any man, by nature of his manness, that doesn't qualify him to lead the liturgy.
That's
actually.
True too.
So
that's true.
It seems like the church, in some ways, is to blame for this by a heretical understanding of the priesthood of the believer, in the sense that, well, we're all prophets, priests, and kings. And so everything that everyone else can do, I can do because I have the Holy Spirit. Right. But Peter's quoting Exodus verbatim in the Septuagint. Israel was the priesthood as well, and yet they still had ordained ministers who did the liturgy. So I don't think what we're necessarily saying is all men, no matter what, can lead because they're men. Only actually a specific kind of man, and it's a man that has been anointed by the Holy Spirit with the laying on of hands in order to take on the role of prophet, priest, kingly functions, because we are going to war. I mean, liturgy, worship is warfare, it's sacrifice, it's prophesying, it's, the Father speaking to his children. So there's just, I don't know. I think there's more problems to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit on a bunch of huge things there. So yeah, think about the that theme that we talk about a lot in our circles. Worship is warfare.
Yeah.
Okay. We need to remember priests were typically armed.
Jericho.
Jericho. Priests were to guard the sanctuary. So you think about, Adam's the original priest. Okay. So
they carried knives everywhere for sacrifices.
For sacrifices, absolutely. So back up just a little bit. So Adam is the first priest. let me go one step further back and just lay this out too, because this ties in with what you said. Historically, Reformed and Presbyterian traditions, and this would apply to Anglicanism. I think you would find similar things in Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. But it's especially in the Reformed and Presbyterian tradition that this comes into its own. There's a distinction between the royal priesthood and the servant priesthood. Between the general priesthood and the special priesthood. So again, think about Israel. The whole nation Israel is a nation of priests. They're all priests. But within Israel, there is one tribe set aside as the special priestly tribe, and they are the ones who will lead the people in sacramental worship. So then you ask, well, how does that translate over into the new covenant? We can say, yes, the whole church is a royal priesthood, but within the royal priesthood, there's a special designation of we could say there are special priests, those who have been qualified and ordained, who have been set aside in order to lead the royal priesthood in worship. They are the liturgical leaders, and that's how that should look. That's how that should work. So yeah, you see that distinction in the Old Covenant with Israel. It carries over, obviously, with appropriate redemptive historical shifts and transformations, but it carries over to the New Covenant too, where you've still got this general priesthood and within it the special priesthood.
Well, and I think what some people could be reacting against is a sort of heavy-handed theobro way of approaching the church. But if priests are the examples of, Adam was the first sacrifice. Christ is the sacrifice. Mm-hmm. I believe every sacrificial animal were males. Mm. So it's a very costly. Paul speaks of being poured out like a drink offering. So the kind of warrior is the one who's, I'm going to go in there and die for the sake of my people. I'm going to Samson this thing. Right. Our priests and our ministers, it's yes, they're masculine. Yes, they have courage, but it's a courage to lay down their life for these people. Right. And I think that also gets kind of left out of the conversation.
Well, I think part of the problem is that
maybe the red heifer,
I guess,
would be the female.
We have so diluted what the pastoral office means that we start to think that, we're such an egalitarian culture. We start to think that, well, anybody should be able to do anything they want. But it is interesting. So I started talking about this and I kind of sidetracked myself, but worship as warfare, like Psalm 110 is really interesting in this regard, because it's really obviously talking about Jesus, who will be a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. But what's interesting is so it's about the priesthood of Jesus. And what's interesting is by the time you get to that end of the Psalm, basically what you have is a big pile of dead bodies, because that's what priests do. Priests kill things. They sacrifice. And so you think, well, okay, what does that mean for pastoral ministry? Well, the word is described as the sword of the Spirit, two-edged sword. What is the pastor doing every Sunday? He is sacrificing the people. He is to take the sword of the Spirit and he is to carve the people up with it. And actually, if you look at, say the book of Leviticus, you see the sacrifices have to be cut in just a certain way. And you do, one thing with this part of the sacrificial animal and something else with another part. You're carving up the animal. And that's what pastors are to do. If they rightly handle the word of God, they're using it as a sword to cut people up and transform them into living sacrifices. But that means that there is something militant and even there's something martial and there's something aggressive about the way that the word should be preached. The word should, if a pastor's rightly preaching the word, he is relentlessly attacking the sins of the people in the congregation.
Right.
Using the word to put their sins to death, to enable, to enable them to be living sacrifices. So one thing that's been pointed out is, men and women have very different orientations to the world and to their relationships. And men tend to be, they do tend to be more aggressive, obviously. And
you would hope.
Yeah, they should be. They should be. That's God's design. Like you think about the things that men are called to do, it requires a level of aggression and toughness, and like men communicate differently. Men naturally tend to communicate very directly, whereas like you listen to a lot of women speak, and they'll almost turn statements of fact into questions. Like the pitch will go up at the end of the sentence and that kind of thing, because they're sort of beckoning for agreement and that kind of thing, whereas men tend to speak much more directly. So you put a woman in a position of leadership in the context of a church, and it completely changes the dynamic, because women tend to be much more empathetic and inclusive. And that has a place, like in the domestic sphere. That's wonderful, and that serves women very well with what they're called to do. But it's a disaster when that becomes the thing that defines the culture of the church, because actually so much of pastoral ministry is warfare. You're fighting against people's sin. You're having to say hard things to people. You're having to excommunicate people. You're having to do things that are difficult in that, and they're hard for men to do.
Sure.
They're hard for men to do.
Yeah.
And this is why I think you can look at churches that have put women in positions of leadership. It's only a matter of time before they drift from orthodoxy, because without that masculine grounding and that masculine spirit leading the church, you're not going to be at war the way that you need to be at war with the world and sin and all of that. So yeah, it absolutely makes a huge difference. Men and women do have different, they're designed differently. And that's because they're called to do different things. Obviously you could take this so far that it becomes too rigid. There's always a ditch on both sides. But just in general, I think that's what we're seeing in our culture. Our culture is heavily feminized, which doesn't mean that women run everything, but it does mean that feminine sensibilities tend to govern things.
Even men.
Even men tend to be, have tended to become much more feminine, and that's what you've seen. And so men have a very difficult time now, because they've been so feminized, doing the kinds of things that they're called to do. I sometimes refer to the LGBTQ movement as FLGBTQ. And by F, I mean feminism.
Okay.
FLGBTQ.
Yeah, right.
It's just add to the acronym, because all of those things are downstream from feminism. Right. They're all the offshoots of feminism. So when feminism creeps into the church, it's not a surprise that everything else goes, because that's exactly what's happened in our culture.
Right.
So, women wanted to usurp the position of men. Men were way too passive and allowed it. And we could talk about, how men are responsible for this. You can go all the way back to the garden, where Adam is effeminate and he's passive, when he should have been active in guarding his bride. And that's the kind of thing that's played out, I think, especially in the last couple centuries in the church. Effeminate, passive men allowing women to take charge, and the resulting disaster.
Well, and at least in some instances, it's the men are trying to gain a virtuous, self-righteous standing with women by appealing to their emotions. And so, they get themselves a little bit of a following, or they get their own kind of harem, but then they end up getting cannibalized by it. And I think for some of our people that come into our church, they're caught off guard sometimes by the way we preach. Oh. And they're like, wow, that's kind of mean, or that's, why are you talking about Christians that way? Yeah. And it's like, well, because we're being serious right now. This is a big deal. This is life and death stuff. And that doesn't mean that everything that I'm criticizing or we're criticizing means these guys aren't our brothers, right? Brothers wrestle and fight and play sports and compete like crazy. And then when it's over, they hang out.
Right.
And I think people just aren't used to masculine, if we can use that language, leadership, doing what you're supposed to do and still being friends. It's like, you've hurt my feelings because you've criticized me. Well, you're a really mean person. And it's like, wait, what? I thought we were just playing basketball, and these were some points that needed to be scored.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right. My church is a lot like yours. Our worships, I was just at your church on Sunday. Our worship service is a lot like yours. We've had, and you may have had this happen too, we've had people come to our church, and people will, two things I've heard people say: this is very masculine, like a very masculine environment. And I'm always, oh, thank you. They don't necessarily mean it as a compliment, but thank you. Or they say it's very intense. And and these are oftentimes people who come from, what would be considered good conservative churches, and our church feels very intense to them. I'm like, well, we are the Christians that mean it. We mean all this stuff. Like, we're not just playing around with it. So yes, absolutely. I think that's true. And I think a lot of times, man to man, men appreciate that kind of direct speech.
Right.
Okay. And I think one thing that you've seen happen in, as this it's interesting. I don't know if you ever read Ann Douglas's book, The Feminization of American Culture. And she's a feminist herself. And she actually thinks that, I would obviously disagree with her here. She thinks that the feminization of American culture was good in every area of life, except for the church. She can recognize that in the church, it actually had a lot of downsides, which is interesting that even a feminist recognizes that, that this has gone too far. But I think that's absolutely what's happened in our churches. I think it's changed the way men preach. It's changed the way pastors preach. So even in churches that have masculine leadership, there can still be a very sort of feminized vibe, that it puts on. I think one other thing, going back to what we were talking about earlier, just with the different roles that God has assigned men and women to play. You've got this slogan that kind of floats around out there now. An unordained woman can do anything that an unordained man can do. And the fundamental problem with that is that it basically treats everybody in the church except one question you'd have is, well, why, why is it that only men can be pastors?
Right.
What is it about, is that arbitrary, or is there something natural about that? And I would say there's very much something natural about it, but also that treats all Christians as if they are androgynous in the rest of life. And that's just a disaster. So this is really, really important, I think, for us to recover and emphasize in our day, because it's something that has absolutely been lost.
Well, and that's how I have a daughter that when she was young, she asked that question, well, why can't women be pastors? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, sweetie, daddies can't be mommies.
Right.
Wives can't be husbands. That's silly, right? And of course, she's like, yes. Right. I'm like, well, daddy is an office. Father is an office. Absolutely. Minister is an office. Right. And this is how God built the world, is to function this way. And so there are times when something bad happens to a daddy and mommy has to kind of take on both roles. And she might do a really good job at that, but that isn't how God made it to be. And I think that's what you see in maybe a Deborah situation, is Deborah isn't actually, she's praised for what she's doing because she's taking up the mantle for men who won't. And that seems like
Barak in that story does not get glory for the victory because, he was semi-faithful,
right?
He recognized that, God had called him to do something, but he wanted the woman there. And so Deborah says, well, okay, fine, but you got to understand a woman's going to get glory for this victory. And if you understand manhood, you realize, oh, wow, not getting glory.
I wanted the glory. I didn't want to have to fight.
Romans 2 tells us we are supposed to pursue glory, honor, and immortality. And so Barak didn't get the full glory of the victory because he had this failure of masculine nerve at the key moment. So it was still good, obviously, that he did what he did, but he was semi-obedient instead of fully obedient, and he lost out on something that should have been his.
That I think Deborah would have gladly given him because of how godly she was. Right, and I think that's one of the things I love about our church is we have never had, and I'll say this for our men as well, we don't have people clamoring for power. We don't have people, because I think we have a good understanding of the institution of the church. And our women are very happy to help in any way, but I've never had some lady be like, well, why don't I get to?
Right.
Because I don't think that's what Deborah would have done. Right. She would have been totally fine if the guy would have done what he was supposed to do. Right. Abigail, if Nabal would have done what he was supposed to do, she would have been totally happy about that.
Abigail's a great illustration of how a woman can still be respectful towards her male authority, even when he's being a fool.
Right.
So Abigail is sort of a model for so a woman who's married to a man who is a fool still has to respect him because of the office he holds. It won't be the same kind of respect that a respectable, honorable man would get, but she's still got to be respectful of the office he holds. But she shows how to navigate that kind of situation, and in that sense is a very good model for women who sometimes find themselves in that situation. And you've got other cases. Obviously it's a fallen world. So you've got Lydia, who seems to be the head of her household. We don't know how that situation came about, but you have situations like that where that can happen. But yes, obviously, here's another way to think about it. There's a lot of familial language that is used for the church.
Absolutely.
So Paul describes the church, like in 1 Timothy 3, as a household. And so if you think about that, a household has a head, and normally the head of the household is going to be the man. It's going to be the husband and the father. Well, by analogy, that's how the church is going to function as well. So again, however you look at it, there's other things I could point out. Like we started off talking about 1 Corinthians. One thing that's really interesting about 1 Corinthians is that Paul again and again says brothers,
Right.
brothers. The whole letter is addressed to the men of the Corinthian church.
Which are, I think, a technical term, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, and I don't think we should just think he's using brothers inclusively of now. Obviously, when the letter of 1 Corinthians was read to the congregation, women are there. They heard it read. It's got all kinds of application for them to make, so it is for them in that way. But Paul is addressing the men of the church because they are the ones who have responsibility for the state of this community.
right.
You think about the pastoral epistles. We don't have a woman. We don't have a pastoral epistle addressed to a woman because there are no women pastors.
Right.
It's addressed to Timothy and Titus, and so again, just this is God's design, and you see it again and again and again, and it's so important because this is really where, if it's not the biggest battle in our culture, it's certainly one of the biggest battles in our culture. Is this understanding of sex, sexuality, the role of the sexes, and the church has allowed herself to be deeply influenced by the world. Even, again, ostensibly conservative churches, confessional churches have allowed themselves to be infiltrated and influenced by all kinds of worldly ideologies in this particular area. It's a huge problem.
Well, and I think that's where we will eventually see the victory, because I do think in our churches that recognize the familial nature of the church, the typological way that God has built things into creation, we're the ones having the most kids.
Oh, right, right.
We're the ones that are
with the happiest and healthiest
joyful,
families.
Happiest, and that's not to say there's not problems, but you do have prophetesses very rarely pop up in the scriptures, and it's always when things aren't going well. So Huldah pops up.
And you also don't have prophetesses prophesying in a gathered liturgical assembly.
Right.
It seems like their prophesying takes place. So it's the same kind of thing when people say, oh, well, after the resurrection, didn't Jesus tell Mary to go proclaim the gospel to the apostles? And isn't that establishing that women can be pastors? It's like, no. Nobody has ever said that women can't do evangelism, and
Right.
nobody has ever said that women can't have private conversations like Apollo and like Aquila and Priscilla had with Apollo. Obviously women can share what they know and can talk about biblical truths in informal settings. And this goes back to the regulative principle that I mentioned earlier. The regulative principle kicks in a worship service. So it's kind of like if you're driving down a road and it says you're now entering the city of Portland, so there are going to be different rules that apply when you enter the city limits. They've got their own laws there. In Portland, they have some pretty crazy laws. I don't know, but you know that it's going to be regulated differently because you've entered into a new jurisdiction. And as soon as a worship service begins, when the pastor says, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and
Amen.
begins the worship service, you're in a new jurisdiction. And so there are going to be, now it's an intensification, you could say, of the patterns that apply in the rest of life, but it's a jurisdiction where things are a lot stricter, because this is a special gathering of God's people in his heavenly presence. And so certain rules apply that would not apply elsewhere. That's the kind of thing that I think we've got to keep in mind.
Well, and that's why I think keeping the biblical order of worship is really important.
Mm-hmm.
I've had question, well, could a woman do announcements? Well, in our church, absolutely, because it's not a part of the worship service.
Right.
But you have churches that will do announcements in the middle of the service,
right.
and it's out of order.
Right.
And when you begin to introduce extra biblical worship, you're going to also introduce unbiblical ways of doing worship.
Well, here's another example. So one thing that your church does, you do a Q&A session after the service.
Right.
But note that it's after the service.
Right.
And then so when I was there Sunday, when we did the Q&A service, you had men and women both asking questions. No problem with that. If you did your Q&A within the service, Paul gives rules about that in 1 Corinthians 14. Ask your husband at home. So, so even something like that, there's a different set of rules that apply. So yeah, there's just a lot of different ways that you can work this out. A lot of different implications that you can draw out of this.
Well, and I think what we have to learn to do is to learn to love the way God made things and trust that he knows what he's doing. So I think we start asking questions about, can I do this? Can I do that? Well, I want to do this or I want to do that. Well, if God has told us there's certain ways to do it, and it rubs us the wrong way, well, that's okay. But let's figure out, why is this rubbing us the wrong way? Because there's something about God I'm not understanding.
Right.
There's something about the way that he's made things that I don't quite get. I want to bring even my affections in line with how God built it. So I actually want to see it beautiful that men are leading worship.
Right. We should rejoice in God's design, embrace God's design and rejoice in it. Absolutely. And I think what feminism has done, feminism is a rebellion against God by rebelling against nature. Mm-hmm. So it's rebellion against nature and therefore rebellion against nature's God. And what feminism has trained women to do is think of themselves as victims and think of themselves as oppressed if they don't get to do everything that a man can do. And so it's framed as an issue of justice. We're being unjust to women if we say, you can't be a pastor, you can't lead liturgy. But this is not about, actually, if you go with the Augustinian definition of justice, which I think is biblical, which is giving to each his due, then you would say, actually, it's an injustice to a woman to put her in a position that she's not designed for, that she's not made for, and it's bad for everybody to do that. So, but that's one of those things. Feminism has really trained women to think of themselves as victims and to think of themselves as oppressed. And the only way to overcome the oppression and rectify the injustice is if women can do everything men can do. And again, like you said, I mean, the logical end of that. This is why I say it's LGBTQ. So, like, the logical end of that is transgenderism.
Right, exactly.
I mean, feminism is the original transgenderism. Feminism, basically from the beginning, was women pretending to be men or women thinking that they had to be men in order to have value and significance. Whereas Paul says, no, actually, your femininity is a very special and unique glory that no man has.
Right.
In fact, your femininity is, it's the crown of your husband. It's a glory for your husband. It's a glory he doesn't have.
Yeah.
He's lacking that glory without you. So again, God's design is best. God's design is beautiful. God's design is full of wisdom. God's design is what we were made for. And when we abandon God's design, it creates havoc. It creates chaos.
Yeah, it doesn't help people. We've been doing a series of talks on having Bible eyes. We've talked a little bit about trauma, talked about abuse language, kind of the critical theory, the oppressor psychology. A lot of the cures that people who would rebel against God offer are worse than the disease.
Absolutely.
And so it's not just that we're, trying to be precise about these things because we're persnickety. It's actually, we love people. We believe what God has said, and we want for you what God would have for you if you would just trust him. It's actually so much better.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
way.
Yeah. So think about this. Marxism is premised on this whole oppressor-oppressee dynamic. And for Marx, it was about socioeconomic class. The rich always oppress the poor. What's happened, and it's interesting because, Marxists realized that was not going to work in America because our middle, we had wealthy people, but then our middle class was so happy they were just too content to ever revolt the way Marx needed them to. So they had to find other ways to turn people into victims and into oppressees. And so you get feminism, which is basically the Marxist logic applied to the relationship of the sexes. You get critical race theory, which is basically the Marxist oppressor-oppressee dynamic applied to racial and ethnic groups. And that's what they've tried to do. And then it filters out to all these other things. Yeah. So anybody who tries to exercise authority over me is now being abusive.
Right.
So parents are abusive, pastors are abusive, teachers are abusive, coaches are abusive. Anybody in a position of leadership in that paradigm becomes intrinsically abusive unless they're not really leading at all. Right. The moment they try to exert any kind of authority, that's oppressive.
Which because it's against the way God built it, turns into the thing that it says it hates.
Right.
So they oppressed become the oppressors. They have to, on their terms, they have to be the ones that are oppressing because now they get to call the shots no matter what that has on the other people. So, all right. Well, I don't know how long we've been going, but that's typically longer than normal, but I wish we could go even longer. I've very much enjoyed this. Thank you for taking the time. I'm sure we'll have folks peppering you with more questions on Friday. So looking forward to that. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Bo.
Hope hope to have a good rest of the week with you.
Great. Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks for listening today. That's all the time that we have. We hope that the discussion has been helpful. If you have more questions about this or any other topic, please text me or Pastor Cogbill, or you can email us at morebible@reformationcovenant.org. Again, that's morebible@reformationcovenant.org. Until next time, remember to make best use of the time that God has given you for His glory and the life of the world. Goodbye.